Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 covers thinking, language, and intelligence. So we're going to start off with the thinking portion of that, which is cognitive psychology, starting off with the ideas of mental imagery. And so let's start off by talking about what it is we're talking about. What is cognition? Cognition are mental activities and processes associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating information. So it's kind of like your intuitive understanding of what you mean when you say thinking. Right? Cognition is knowing, remembering, communicating information. It contains many, many different things. We're just going to talk about a subset of those things this week. Cognition, of course, supports other psychological processes. So let's talk about mental imagery. It's kind of one of the more intuitive ways to think about this whole concept. When you think about thinking, you probably think about your internal representations of things that are not currently being sensed, sort of like your internal environment. You might call it a mental picture of something, but is that really what it is? In fact, mental imagery is kind of a misnomer. It's not just a picture-like image. It can pertain to any sense. So mentally rehearsing a dance. So right now, if you imagine going through a complex set of movements, that's motoric imagery. If you imagine touching something, what might it feel like to touch sandpaper? We would call that haptic imagery. If I ask you the question, whose voice is deeper, Morgan Freeman's or Jim Carrey's, you can imagine what those voices might sound like, almost hear them, and compare them in your mind. It's easy to sort of imagine what a voice might sound like. And you can sort of imagine those voices and compare which one might be deeper. Though that said, most research has been done on visual imagery. Okay, so take a look at these stimuli here. We have 5 number 3s, but actually 2 of them are backwards. Which ones? It doesn't really pop out at you, right? So you might have to do some thinking about that. And how do you solve this problem? Do you try to reconstruct the 3, or do you try to sort of mentally flip that? Which way does it work for you? So when you're asked to work with an object like that, to rotate it in your mind, research suggests that we don't recreate the object. We actually take the object we see in front of us and mentally rotate it. So for this graph, I'm showing you data from a task in which participants were asked to mentally rotate the letter R in various orientations. And as you can see, the reaction time plotted here varies as a function of how severe the rotation is, peaking at 180-degree rotation. So the more off from its default state the object is, the longer it takes us to mentally rotate it. This suggests that our mental representation of an object is at least somewhat like a real object, right? That we can't just work with it as fluidly as we might like. It's something that can be physically turned and moved and manipulated around in our mind. It retains some physical properties of the actual stimulus itself. It's not this thoroughly mutable thing. But that's not the only side. So are our mental images like real images? Do we have like a little copy of whatever we've seen in our mind that we can work with? Well, let's try a little activity for that. Form a mental image of this picture. So this thing right here, this collection of lines making this sort of shape. I want you to try to do your best to remember what this shape looks like. Then I'm going to ask you on the next slide, which of the pictures on the next slide are part of this picture? So what figures that you see on the next slide could possibly be a component of this picture? When you're ready, go ahead and, so pause, and then when you're ready, go ahead and unpause. Okay. Is object 1 something that could fit into the figure you've seen previously? What about object 2? Was that there? How about object 3? Was that part of the previous figure? What about 4? Is that something that could fit into the figure you saw on the previous slide? Okay, here's the image you saw previously. So we can see here that 1 does indeed fit, right here. 2, this hourglass type shape, fits right here. And so does 4. This trapezoid fits right here. But 3, perhaps one that seems like it should be present, is not. There's no place that that can go. So what does that mean? It means that our mental objects are not the perfect representations that we think they might be. They lack some resolution. They're not quite real, right? They're not exact copies of what we've seen before. They're our recollection of them and our reconstruction of them. So while there are some aspects, some evidence that suggests that our mental images are constrained by the objects themselves, right? Like trying to rotate an object, relies on the physical properties of that object being manipulated in our 3D space. There are limits to that as well, right? We don't retain a perfect copy of the stimulus we've seen. We lose some details in our imagery process. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of imagery. Next time we're going to move on to the idea of forming concepts.